Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first session in our new webinar series, with today's talk being titled Decoding MEPC 83, Simplifying the IMO's Net Zero Framework. My name is Paul Howe, and I am the Digital Marketing Manager here at IDWL, and I will be your host today. I'm delighted to also be joined by my colleagues, Scott Mitchell, our Technical Development Officer, and John Nicholson, our Head of Technical. Together, they will be helping to break down the IMO's draft net zero framework. So that will be what it means, what the commercial implications could be, and how you can prepare. So before we get into that, I believe introductions are in order. So Scott, could you tell us a bit more about your background and what you do at IDWL specifically?
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much, Paul. And firstly, thanks everyone else for joining us today. My name's Scott Mitchell, and I'm the Technical Development Officer here at IDWL. I come from a seafaring background myself, having spent 11 years as an engineering officer, mainly serving on VLCCs and Suezmax tankers, but also having some other experience on smaller product tankers and RoPax ferries. I came ashore and joined IDWL in October 2022, so I've been here now for just short of 3 years. I firstly joined IDWL as a technical officer responsible for reviewing and QCing the reports submitted by our surveyors, along with carrying out condition inspections, sale and purchase inspections, both in person and via remote review. I was then promoted to my current role of TDO in January 2024, which was a new role dedicated to maintaining and refining our checklists, creating new products, and managing the background criteria and the algorithm behind our IDWL grade. In addition to this, I'm quite heavily involved in a lot of other client-facing project management work and offering other consultancy services. In order to maintain and refine our products, another aspect of my role involves tracking industry trends, things like changes in legislation and requirements, and keeping an eye on emerging technologies in industry, all with a view to keeping what we offer up to date and in line with the needs of our clients and any other stakeholders in the industry, really anyone who might end up reading an IDWL report. Quite a large amount of my time personally in the last few months has been spent reading and listening to a lot of things about the IMO's new decarbonisation plans, and that's really why I'm here today.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks a bunch. And John, could you do the same?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Head of Technical at IDWL, which is a team that currently consists of 15 ex-seafarers from various backgrounds. I'm also an ex-seafarer myself and a qualified master. I spent the seagoing part of my career with Maersk on the container ships and the offshore fleets, and I've been with IDWL for 7 years now, since 2018. The main area of responsibility is Head of Technical, creating the technical contents of all of our products, along with Scott, ensuring that IDWL are producing technically accurate and detailed inspection reports which meet our clients' requirements and expectations. The constant development and progression of the IDWL grading system, providing technical advice and guidance both internally and externally. I also attend vessel inspections in the UK and around Europe as and when required. And survey and management also falls under the responsibility of my technical team. Thanks, Paul.
Amazing. Thanks, John. So next up, just a tiny bit of housekeeping before we begin. So we've got a lot of stuff to get through today, but we do understand that you may have questions as we run through. So at the bottom of your screen, you can find the Q&A functionality of the webinar. So feel free to drop in your questions, and after post-webinar, we will ensure to get back to you. We might not have to have time for a live Q&A today. So this webinar is also being recorded, and a copy of that recording will be sent to all of you post-webinar. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with us, we are very proud to be recognised as the industry leader in independent ship inspections, technology and data. And to give you a sense of the scale of IDWL, in 2023, more than 50% of all vessels sold carried an IDWL report alongside, and since 2019, we've physically inspected over 15% of of the global fleet. So that equates to about 15 inspection reports being delivered to clients every working day. To date, we've inspected more than 12,000 unique vessels across 100 countries, and whilst doing that, we have collected over 10 million data points. Our platform does also now hold 60,000 predictive IDWL grades across the dry bulk tanker, container, and general cargo fleet. And all of this is, of course, underpinned by our world-spanning surveyor network and our 5 offices worldwide in the UK, Greece, China, Japan, and Singapore. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Scott, who will run over what we are looking at today. And of course, then John and Scott getting into the nitty-gritty detail of the IMO net zero framework.
Yep, thanks again, Paul. So really what we're hoping to achieve today is to simplify the IMO's net zero framework draft proposal as much as we can, give it some background and context, and hopefully provide a wider audience the knowledge and the understanding to navigate the proposal if or when it's adopted. Whilst we do believe that most people in the industry are aware of it, as I imagine most of the attendees here today are, we are under the impression that many others might not be, or at least don't yet appreciate the potentially huge consequences it will have throughout the industry if it's adopted. I hope that this is certainly the intention, that we'll be able to clarify certain aspects of the proposal in plain and simple terms. We can address some FAQs and shed some light on other considerations that you might not yet have thought of, all whilst hopefully adding some value into your planning and decision making at this early stage. There were many topics addressed at MEPC 83 in April. However, for the purpose of this presentation, we'll be focusing specifically on the announcement of the net zero framework. We should stress at this point that it is very much still a draft proposal and nothing's guaranteed. With there being still quite a few hurdles to overcome, which John will talk about shortly. And just for your information, and as I imagine many of you might already be aware, this presentation is planned to be the first of a 3-part series, with the second and third presentations covering firstly alternative fuel options and then energy saving devices.
So leading on nicely from that, Scott, can you give us a brief overview of the outcome of MEPC 83 and the IMO's net zero framework more specifically?
Yeah, well, yep. So starting with a bit of the background behind it, the shipping industry transports more than 80% of the world's trade volume, and we actually do have the lowest carbon footprint per tonne of cargo carried. However, we do still produce around 3% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. That number itself might seem small, but again, given a bit of context to it, if international shipping was a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gases worldwide. In tandem with other industries such as the land transportation industry and aviation specifically, there's a clear desire and need for this to be improved, especially with various projections showing that by 2050, global shipping demands might increase by a further 50%. Commercially, it seems from the research that we've done, the biggest and the most dominant driver for these changes, like I say, from a commercial point of view, seems to be cargo owners and charterers and financial institutions and financiers who are connecting vessels' emissions performance to the lending. Going a little bit further back, the Paris Agreement was developed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and this entered into force in 2016. Its goal was to limit the increase in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees, above pre-industrial temperatures, but preferably below 1.5 degrees. The UNFCCC identified the three greenhouse gases that contribute the most to climate change, or i.e. having the highest global warming potential, these being carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O. In addition to this, the IMO itself has identified 6 further substances that require some degree of emission control, with these being nitrogen oxides, NOx, sulfur oxides, SOx, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and black carbon. I think personally a good and quite simple place to start this presentation with is the definition of net zero emissions, with this being the balancing of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere with an equivalent amount removed, which would in essence neutralise the overall impact of emissions. Achieving net zero is crucial in our efforts in stopping our, or more specifically, humanity's contribution to global warming. And in practice, net zero is aimed to be achieved by a combination of reducing our current emissions and actively removing any remaining or existing emissions. The most recent climate objectives were set out in the IMO's 2023 greenhouse gas strategy. Since then, a new draft proposal has been put together by the Intersessional Working Group on Reduction of Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Ships. I appreciate that's quite a mouthful, and this was the proposal that was put forward at MEPC 83. The session itself took place from the 7th to the 11th of April of this year at the IMO headquarters in London, and the proposal includes both technical and economic elements, which I'll go on to discuss it in more detail just shortly. Basically, the proposals are a set of mid-term greenhouse gas, or otherwise referred to as GHG, reduction measures aimed at achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by or around 2050. And this proposal is now more formally known as the Net Zero Framework, and it also has an associated GFI standard. Again, I'll discuss that in more detail. The idea really is to implement a first of its kind global fuel standard, which is intended to encourage innovation, set a direction of travel for the industry, and kickstart further investment in the renewable fuels sector. The framework itself will involve the implementation of MARPOL Annex 6, Chapter 5, and generally compliance will require the uptake of zero or near zero, otherwise again referred to as ZNZ, greenhouse gas emission technologies, mainly fuels or other energy sources. And apologies in advance for the number of new acronyms that are involved here. I'm sure we're probably all going to have to get used to them in the coming years. The draft proposal was approved in April, and it's now due for formal adoption next month from the 14th to the 17th of October, where there'll be an extraordinary session of the MEPC, the Marine Environment Protection Committee, with this session being known as ES2. At this point, we're expecting this to be done via a voting system, which is actually quite unusual in itself, as the IMO normally works on a consensus basis, but the regulations are expected to be adopted as of now, pending no major surprises. The vote itself will require the approval of 2/3 of the 108 parties that prescribe to MARPOL Annex 6, who themselves represent 97% of the world's merchant fleet in terms of tonnage, and the vote will only consider yes and no votes, not any abstentions. This 2/3 majority also needs to represent at least 50% of the global gross tonnage, and really we therefore kind of suspect that in the time that's elapsed since MEPC 83 in April, there's probably been quite a lot of political lobbying going on behind the scenes to acquire all the necessary votes. At the moment, we only really understand the foundations of the policy, with many things such as like the finer details and supporting guidelines are still to be published. However, what we do understand is that the proposal that was approved in April, specifically the core elements and the timeline for its implementation, are not going to be up for renegotiation in October. Any changes will only relate to improving clarity and removing any ambiguities in the legislation. It does kind of seem to us that it's very much an all or nothing, take it or leave it kind of vote.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So I suppose naturally leading on to that, what would the timeline look like, and what ships are these new regs going to be applicable to?
So based on what's been published to date, and as we currently understand it, the adoption vote is expected next month in October, like I said. The approval of detailed implementation guidelines should then be published at MEPC 84 in spring next year. The regulations themselves will then enter into force on the 1st of March 2027, 16 months after formal adoption as per the IMO's tacit acceptance procedure. By autumn 2027, fuel pathways should have been approved. The applicable amendments will be made to the SEMP, the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, specifically its reporting requirements and its methodology, and the IMO GFI register will have been formed. The regulations will then take effect on the 1st of January 2028, i.e. the effective date, where ships will then start collecting the required data and emissions data. And then finally, the ships will be required to submit that data for verification from January 2029 onwards, with the first verification to be concluded by June 2029. In terms of applicability, the framework will be applicable to all ships of more than 5,000 gross tons, with a few following exemptions. Ships only operating in the domestic waters of their flag state. In this case, it's expected that flag should introduce their own equivalent requirement. Ships not using mechanical propulsion, military and government non-commercial vessels, and things like FPSOs, FSUs, drilling rigs, and semi-subs, although there's already rumours that they might be included in future years after further revisions.
Okay, so what are the main differences between these new and existing regulations?
So really, traditionally, vessels have had to adhere to what we call tank to wake, or TTW, emission and efficiency rules, things like the EEDI, EEXI, and CII more recently. These being emissions generated really exclusively on board and to do with the efficiency of a vessel. The biggest change is that the new chapter now also includes the regulation of well to tank, or WTT, emissions, so now covering the fuel's production and supply, this being if applicable, the processing of any biomass, the refining process, the distribution and transport of the fuel, and the pumping of the fuel to the vessel. Basically, the complete life cycle analysis of the fuel will now be assessed, as summarised on the slide here. WTT plus TTW equals WTW, or well to wake, and this is really what will now be covered, the entire fuels value chain. Essentially, the new regulations are really a measure of the efficiency and emissions of the fuel itself, and not only that of the ship. The second biggest change probably is that until now, in terms of greenhouse gases at least, the IMO has only regulated CO2 emissions. The new amendments will also cover methane and nitrous oxide emissions. Taking a well-to-wake approach is very important, really, as a fuel sustainability is influenced by a large number of factors and parameters, and this approach will provide a significantly more comprehensive assessment of a fuel's true greenhouse gas intensity than a tank-to-wake, as we do currently, approach does. A good example is that you can have a fuel produced using renewable energy, but it's then transported a long distance to its final use point, meaning it might actually end up having higher well-to-wake emissions than an, on paper at least, less efficient fuel that's been produced and consumed locally. All fuels are going to be supplied to a vessel with a fuel life cycle label, or FLL, that states the fuel's GFI. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'll elaborate a wee bit further on the GFI later on. The requirements are quite similar to those that were recently introduced in Fuel EU Maritime, but there's a few differences. And at this point, we're still waiting on clarifications to be made and as to what the crossover will be and how these two regulations might be aligned and harmonised.
Okay, so to dive a bit deeper there, I think a good place to start is how exactly are well-to-wake emissions assessed?
So just to give a bit of background there, following a request from the MEPC at MEPC 81, The joint group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection, or otherwise known as the GSAMP, established a working group on marine fuel life cycle greenhouse gas intensity. The well-to-wake approach I just described, it's actually more formally known as a fuels life cycle assessment, or LCA. I should start this section probably by stating that we don't yet know everything that the IMO Net Zero Framework's LCA will include, but based on existing regulations such as Fuel EU, for example, what we can do is outline the general process and things that probably will be considered in the assessment. An LCA calculates the total greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with a fuel from its production right through to its end use. It involves like a comprehensive accounting of the emissions at each stage of a fuel's life cycle. Again, as I said, including the feedstock production, the process and the transportation, and then finally the combustion of the fuel. As you can all probably imagine, there's quite a lot and almost endless number of variables involved in this assessment, and it's a very complex thing to be all-encompassing. The LCAs and the FLLs will need to be certified by a recognised sustainable fuel certification scheme, i.e. a scheme that's recognised by the MEPC, which certifies that any given fuel is actually compliant with the new net zero framework requirements. At each step of fuel production, different amounts of greenhouse gas emissions are almost always produced to some degree, an example of which is demonstrated on the slide here. And the total footprint is then calculated by adding all of these individual emissions together. It's currently anticipated that fossil fuels will be assigned conservative default values regardless of where the fuel was produced, meaning that all fossil fuel production globally will be treated relatively equally. For sustainable and alternative fuels, it's anticipated that they'll be assessed more uniquely based on the exact production pathway that's been used in their creation. So we look at the full life cycle assessment process as being three main steps. Firstly, the feedstock management. This really assesses any agricultural sector impacts if they're applicable, i.e., or for an example, relevant during the production of biofuels. And this would also include any increases and decreases in feedstock or livestock needs. It also includes factors such as the impacts of any co-products used, such as grains for livestock feed. One of the biggest considerations in the full LCA process is the emissions generated from land use change, such as cultivating new land for fuel production. To be a bit more specific, it's still very unclear how the IMO life cycle analysis is going to account for things such as indirect land use change, or ILUC, specifically, with this being the downstream changes in land use that occur as a result of a change in land use within a specific region. For example, when land is converted to produce biofuels, existing agricultural land has to shift to another location, which potentially involves deforestation or the destruction of wetlands. Much as an example, much of the controversy surrounding palm oil production is a good example and results from ILUC. In terms of the suitability of a feedstock itself, a number of factors are typically assessed. Things like how much of it exists, how much of it can be viably extracted or harvested, emissions and waste generated during extraction or harvesting, how much competition there is for its use, how easily it can be transported to production sites, and if there are any restrictions or limitations on the use of that resource. The second step being production and distribution, whereby the LCA assessment will likely include emissions factors for any process energy used, for example, the burning of natural gas or coal or the use of electricity. This would be for any upstream and downstream operations such as extraction, transport and distribution. In terms of the actual refining or production process itself, all energy and material inputs used during handling, processing and storage of any feedstocks, any co-products used, intermediate products and the resultant fuel will also likely be included. just to quickly touch on what probably won't be included in the assessment would be things like any activities that are clearly unrelated to the fuel life cycle. For example, a fuel production company participates in an offset project such as reforestation or invest in other renewable energy initiatives. Secondly, any emissions associated with physical infrastructure. Again, as an example, emissions that result from the construction of a new refinery or a new processing facility. And lastly, any emissions associated with organisational infrastructure. A good example being employees commuting to the facility. Factors such as these are, as you can imagine, almost indeterminable and would be too difficult to include. And the third and last step in the process is the end use. And as I already said earlier, the combustion exhaust emissions from using the fuel are also included as part of the life cycle analysis. As mentioned, this now not only includes carbon dioxide as we've done traditionally, but also includes methane and nitrous oxide. I think the general takeaway is that this is an extremely complex assessment, and trying to establish uniform standards to ensure a consistent assessment is made will remain a huge challenge for the foreseeable. It's almost impossible to be exhaustive in determining the factors and parameters selected to estimate both the WTT and the TTW emissions. Whilst TTW, or tank to wake, is definitely more straightforward, even this is still subject to discrete variations in vessel design. I think, in summary, what's essentially trying to be achieved here is going from a purely tank to wake approach for fuels that are widely produced and used and have the same or similar production pathways, for example, HFO or VLSFO, going from that to a full life cycle and well-to-wake approach for lesser known fuels with endlessly varying production routes. It is actually a very monumental task that can't be overstated. And just again to reiterate, it is still unclear what factors will be included in the LCA's the life cycle assessment specific to the net zero framework and how accurately each fuel is going to be assessed. So it's one of those things we're just going to have to wait and see. And just quickly to touch, as shown on the slide here, the illustration kind of gives an indication just of the extent of processes that are involved in the production, transport and end use of a variety of fuels, shown here for MGO, LNG and hydrogen. Things like raw materials, energy and water are used in varying quantities at each stage, normally with solid waste and or emissions also produced at each stage. In our second plan presentation, like I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to cover alternative fuels, and we're going to discuss some of these processes in a bit more detail then.
Amazing, thank you. Really good information there. So you previously mentioned a fuel's GFI. So can you provide a bit more detail as to what that is for us and how it is that calculated, and also maybe how that factors into the new regulations?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really where we'll start getting into what the proposal and the new regulations actually involve. Firstly, the abbreviation GFI itself, it stands for the Greenhouse Gas Fuel Intensity Standard. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the technical element upon which the new regulations have been built. Basically, it's the metric that's going to be used to determine the amount of annual well-to-wake greenhouse gas emissions that are used on a ship, and it's going to be measured in grams of CO2 equivalent per unit of energy. The equivalent, or the EQ as it's being referred to, that I just mentioned, refers to the equivalent CO2 emissions that are emitted from the newly measured methane and nitrous oxide. Just to elaborate on how a vessel's attained GFI is calculated, really it's the sum of all fuels and energy sources that are used on board in a year, with this incorporating the greenhouse gas intensity of each of those sources. This is then multiplied by the amount of energy from each of those sources, which is then all divided by the total energy that's used on board. If you look at the middle formula on the slide, EIJ would be the greenhouse gas intensity of each energy source, and energy J is the amount of energy from that source. We're also of the understanding that the attained GFI will include electrical power that's delivered to the vessel from shore via any wind-assisted propulsion that you may have, and from other things like solar power. However, it is still unclear how these are going to be factored into the calculation, and we anticipate that the actual calculation that's going to be in use is going to be more complex than the one that we have shown here. In short, really, conventional hydrocarbon fuels aren't going to comply with the new requirements. The smaller a fuel's GFI, the smaller its well-to-wake emissions. So as shown on this slide, the new net zero framework will introduce 2 levels of compliance: base, or otherwise known as tier 2, and direct compliance, which is tier 1. The requirements become gradually more stringent from 2028 to 2050. As per the proposal, these reduction trajectories are already fixed and set from 2028 to 2035, and it's therefore they're probably not going to change if the proposals are adopted in October. The reference or the starting point is based on the global average GFI from 2008. It's very important to note, and this is one point that seems to have caused some confusion in the industry, that even though there's 2 tiers of compliance, ships will be required to meet the stricter direct compliance target. It's just how this is achieved that has some variability. Just to clarify on that, it won't be an option for owners or operators just to comply with the base target. It should also be noted, and it's quite important to keep this in mind, that the framework and the reduction trajectories are planned to be subject to comprehensive review, and any changes applied if necessary every 5 years.
Okay, so at the beginning you mentioned that the new regulations encourage the use of alternative fuels and other low emission energy sources. So can you discuss the mechanisms that reward vessels that do so, and conversely, I suppose, what is the impact on the vessels who don't?
Well, yeah, I think it probably makes more sense to start with the second point. And just to reiterate, despite there being the two compliance tiers, ships will be required to meet the stricter direct compliance target. As a result of that, there are therefore essentially 2 tiers of non-compliance. So firstly, a tier 1 or direct compliance deficit, as shown in the left-hand image on the slide here. This is characterised by the vessel's attained GFI falling in between the green line for direct compliance and the red line for base compliance. This means that the vessel is compliant with the base requirement but non-compliant with the direct requirement. The only option to balance a tier 1 deficit like this is by purchasing remedial units from the IMO register at a price of $100 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. It's probably expected that, at least in the initial years, most vessels are going to fall in this area, where they'll comply with the base target, probably by employing slightly lower GFI fuels such as drop-in biofuels, and then they can pay the penalty cost to account for their direct compliance deficit. A tier 2 deficit, or a base deficit, which is illustrated in the right-hand image on this slide, is characterised by the vessel's attained GFI falling above base compliance, i.e. coming in above the red line. In this case, the vessel is then non-compliant with both the direct and the base requirements, and will begin to accrue both a tier 1 and a tier 2 deficit, if that makes sense. To balance a tier 2 deficit, you have a few options, with the first one being you can purchase remedial units from the IMO register at a price of $380 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. Secondly, you can transfer surplus units from another vessel. This possibly can be either from a vessel within your fleet or done via private sale between owners or operators, and probably the market demand will dictate the going rate for these the transfer of the cost for transferred units. I'll actually describe surplus units in more detail on the next slide. Lastly, you can use banked surplus units accrued that you've accrued in previous years. Just again, important to note that these will expire within 2 years of being banked. With each of those three options, it is important to note again that once the Tier 2 deficit has been balanced, you'll still need to balance the Tier 1 deficit by purchasing remedial units from the IMO register at a price of $100 per tonne of CO2 equivalent, as I described a minute ago. And just a few further points to note about the deficits. Really, this is the financial penalty system that bases the economic element of the regulations that I mentioned at the start of the presentation. Secondly, a deficit of 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent will require 1 remedial unit to be balanced. So in this regard, it is linear, and the pricing of remedial units is going to be reviewed and adjusted from 2031. So the $100 and the $380 are just between now and 2030. So moving on to surplus units, vessels whose attained GFI is less than the required GFI will be considered to be in direct compliance and will then begin to accrue what are being termed as surplus units. In this case, a statement of compliance will be issued and no further action will be needed. This is what's shown on the slide here, where the ship's attained GFI, the grey line, is below the direct compliance requirement, the green line. I'll now just briefly touch on what you can and can't do with any accrued surplus units. Firstly, transfer. Where a Tier 2 deficit has been accrued, surplus units can be transferred from a ship that's generated a surplus. This is, at this point at least, expected to be done via private agreements between operators and will be charged at a maximum of 380 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, logically, this being the same price that you can buy the Tier 2 remedial units directly from the IMO register. Really, this is essentially a pooling method where a specified group of vessels can collectively meet the greenhouse gas targets, even if individual ships don't necessarily meet them. As I mentioned earlier, again, this is quite similar to what's been implemented in Fuel EU Maritime. Secondly, bank. You can bank any accrued surplus units, and as I mentioned on the last slide, you just have to keep in mind that these will expire if they've not been used or transferred within 2 years, and the bank surplus units can be used only to balance a Tier 2 deficit. And lastly, voluntary surrender, with this being that any surplus units can be surrendered under a voluntary contribution scheme, although for obvious financial reasons, I'm not personally convinced how popular an option this is going to turn out to be. And just one further point to note on surplus units, the surplus units cannot be transferred and then banked, i.e. they must be used immediately after being transferred, and they can only be transferred to a ship that has a Tier 2 deficit. This with the intention of avoiding people holding surplus units.
Okay, just to jump in there, you mentioned that banked surplus units will only last for 2 years. So what would be the benefit to a vessel that is using zero or near zero fuels banking its surplus units? As in some cases, it will take longer than 2 years for the vessel to start being in a Tier 2 deficit.
So firstly, this is a very, very good question. In short, it wouldn't make sense for a vessel in that scenario to bank its surplus units. Obviously, instances like this would need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, with things like detailed future feasibility and forecasting studies completed. But really, if a vessel isn't expected to start generating a Tier 2 deficit for more than 2 years, it would be completely illogical to bank the surplus units. Really, most sensibly, they would be sold or transferred to another vessel. Saying that, though, one potential use scenario would be a vessel that uses again, as an example, a high-performing biofuel in year 1, accruing a lot of surplus units. They could then follow this immediately by the same vessel using fossil fuels in year 2, where a Tier 2 deficit would be accrued, meaning that the bank surplus units from year 1 could be used to balance a year 2 deficit. Kind of a lot of things like this and specific cases like this are quite unclear, but hopefully when the further guidance notes are published, things like this will be clarified. And really, just to touch on the 2-year expiry date on banked units has drawn some criticism, as within fuel EU, there's no expiry date on banked units.
So presumably we're talking about a lot of generated revenue here, and I presume one of the questions maybe on our viewers' lips is, what will that be used for?
Yes, so I agree. Really, the revenues that are generated as a result of these plans are expected to raise somewhere in the region of 10 to 15 billion with a B dollars per year initially, and this will partly go towards financial rewards for vessels that are using ZNZ fuels. The initial qualifying criteria for a fuel to be regarded as ZNZ will be its GFI being less than 19 grams of CO2 equivalent, with this requirement planned to be tightened to less than 14 grams of CO2 equivalent after 2035. It's unknown at this point what exactly the reward itself is going to be or how the reward scheme will be distributed. Additionally, the revenues will be used to support the wider net zero framework as, in quote, just an equitable transition, unquote, as it's being known, with some possible use cases such as further research and development for ZNZ fuels and energy sources, developing the related and necessary maritime infrastructure, port equipment and bunkering facilities that are going to be needed to support these fuels, providing relevant training and certification for seafarers and the wider maritime workforce. And lastly, and possibly most importantly, will be in assisting disproportionately negatively impacted states with a specific focus on least developed countries, LDCs, and small island developing states, or SIDS.
So that seems like there's going to be a lot of complexity in managing all of this. So how do the IMO intend to control surplus units, deficits, issue Z and Z rewards, etc.?
Firstly, again, I absolutely agree, and I think there will be some, if not quite a lot, of teething issues, especially in the initial years. Just again, to go back on, there is still quite a lot of work to be done here. That's going to be necessary to lay the groundwork and infrastructure to support these new regulations. It's currently planned that all applicable ships will pay an admin fee for the creation and upkeep of a central IMO GFI register, with the admin rate not yet, or it hasn't, at least hasn't been disclosed. It's not yet set, or it hasn't been disclosed. We also don't yet know the proposed structure of the register, or even who will be on its board, or how this will be decided. What we do know is that the register will be responsible for things like crediting the ships that are exceeding Tier 1 compliance with the issuance of surplus units, managing the surplus unit bank, issuing of remedial units when they've been purchased, recording the transfer of surplus units, and the overall control of the reward scheme, the ZNZ reward scheme, and the general net zero fund, as it's being known.
Okay, so who will be responsible for reporting and ensuring compliance with the new regulations if adopted?
So really, in short, it will be the ISM company or the document of compliance DOC holder on behalf of the owner, if that's somebody different, that's going to be responsible for collecting and submitting the required data for verification. They will also be responsible for the payment of any associated costs, things like the admin fees or the non-compliance penalties. It will be the vessel's DOC holder at the end of any 12-month period that's responsible for the full year, even if the DOC holder has changed during that year. Leading on quite naturally from that, provisions will need to be included for any costs. Again, admin fees, non-compliance penalties, or if in the case of alternative fuels, probably increased bunker costs, to be fully or partially covered or recuperated from charterers. This is, at this point at least, expected to be done via private contracts between the DLC holder and the charterer, although the mechanisms for this still aren't really clear. What we do foresee is that this is going to be especially complex for vessels that are frequently on spot charter. Obviously, all this means that existing contracts and charter party agreements are going to need to be renegotiated, and it will also be very important to ensure that all the parties are in agreement as to what and how much has actually been emitted, what's actually reportable, and if there were any applicable exemptions, just in terms of calculating the financial liability. Just to expand a bit more on other considerations regarding the reporting, one question we've seen raised quite a few times now is whether the reporting will need to be voyage-based or event-based. We believe that voyage-based is going to be the minimum requirement. However, event-based reporting will need to be considered if you're expecting any correction factors or exemptions to be applicable during a voyage. For example, an ice-class vessel navigating in icy waters will need to record when the ship enters and exits those waters. Or another example being, if you're using a zero or near zero emission technology for part of a voyage, you'll need to record when you start and stop using it. And lastly, sorry, Paul, I'll just finish. In terms of how things are going to be reported, we understand that the IMO data collection system, the DCS, will be expanded to allow for this GFI reporting. As this is a statutory item, we expect that Flag State will assume the responsibility for ensuring compliance and the issuance of the statements of compliance. And what's now shown on the screen here, this is going to be covered in much more detail in our second planned presentation, but just to briefly touch on it here, fuels that are eligible for receiving the ZNZ reward will likely be many of those that we frequently see prefixed with things like green or E, being that they've been produced using renewable energy. However, this should be caveated by stating that many of these fuels will be very much assessed on a case-by-case basis, and it's entirely dependent on the production pathway of the fuel itself. The left-hand image on the slide here was actually a forecast for Fuel EU maritime compliance, but we're using it here just to give an idea of how long different fuels and different production pathways might remain compliant, noting that it's obviously very difficult to look 25 years into the future with changeable regulations. As a good example from the left-hand image on this slide, there's a huge discrepancy in the total greenhouse gas intensity between liquid hydrogen produced using natural gas, which is actually the highest attaining GFI fuel shown here, and liquid hydrogen that's produced using renewable or E-hydrogen, which is actually the lowest attaining GFI fuel shown on the graph. It's not simply a case of saying liquid hydrogen is a ZNZ fuel. The initial ambition is that 5%, striving for 10% of fuel used in international shipping will be supplied via a ZNZ source by 2030. Just really to elaborate a bit further on the reward scheme and potentially eligible fuels, vessels can be compliant with the base and or the direct compliance requirement without necessarily being eligible for a ZNZ reward. If a vessel is in direct compliance, it will accrue the surplus units, but the ZNZ reward scheme will only be offered to vessels that are burning fuels with a GFI of less than 19 grams of CO2 equivalent, and as I mentioned, tightening to less than 14 grams of CO2 equivalent after 2035. Therefore, in the short term at least, most biofuels and LNG will probably remain viable options in terms of GFI compliance, but likely won't be eligible for the ZNZ reward. Saying that though, some advanced or second generation biofuels might be eligible for the ZNZ reward, especially in the initial years. However, that poses the risk of impeding impeding investment in e-fuels. A few of the examples there are shown in the right-hand image on the slide.
Amazing, thanks. So if a vessel uses Z and Z fuels periodically, but its overall attained GFI is still in a deficit, would that vessel still receive the Z and Z reward?
Yeah, so this is another good question. And this scenario could arise if a vessel is using a combination of both ZNZ fuels and fossil fuels. As far as we know today, the ZNZ reward scheme will be offered to vessels using specific energy sources or fuels, and this has no correlation to the vessel's overall attained GFI. Therefore, we expect in this scenario that the reward would still be offered, but you should just bear in mind that any financial reward from using ZNZ fuels would have to be offset by the requirement to balance a accrued deficit, probably in the purchase of remedial units. And finally, from my side, just to stress again that all of this is still subject to clarification and further guidelines being published.
Amazing, thanks a bunch, Scott. That's some really, really good information there. So moving over to John now, our head of technical. Could you describe what, if any, commercial implications can be anticipated following the implementation of the new measures?
Hi, Paul. Thank you. And hello again to everyone who's listening at the moment. The extent of commercial implications is never fully understood or known until the measures come into place. But based on what we understand to date, there are a number of relatively obvious implications for owners, operators, charters, and other stakeholders to consider at this stage. I might as well start with the obvious one, which is increased OPEX, whether that be the price of compliant fuels or paying for remedial units for non-compliance. Leading on from that, as the cost of goods will likely go up. For example, if a ship accrues a tier 2 deficit, with the owner having to pay $380 a ton of CO2 equivalent to balance, then this cost is passed on to the charterer, who in turn passes it to the cargo owner, who ultimately raises the price of goods to the end user. Secondly, I mean, how ready really is the industry for such a big shift? There are concerns about availability of potential and a potential scarcity of ZNZ fuels, with huge industry uptake. And then there's the additional issue that both aviation and land transport sectors will likely follow similar paths to what shipping is looking to do. There'll also be a lot of port infrastructure upgrades, which are going to be needed, along with upskilling of the wider maritime workforce, and of course, eventual changes to STCW 95. Another consideration is increased regulatory complexity. As Scott mentioned earlier, it's unknown how regulations are going to align or overlap. For example, things like Fuel EU are still going to apply, at least in the interim, and they're both going to need to be complied with. It's still not clear how these two regulations are going to align, especially in regards to fuel life cycle assessments. Generally, these new regulations will be more difficult to comply with, as there's more variability, and quite rapid adaptation is going to be required. The MEPC HSD measures are more stringent than those in Fuel EU, with the rate of the greenhouse gas reduction target increasing faster in the IMO framework. Regulations themselves are also subject to comprehensive review every 5 years, which makes the goalposts constantly changing, which makes it hard for people to plan definitively for the long term. But another very important factor is knowing and fully understanding your emissions data. This will become business critical, especially for a vessel that you purchase secondhand. And lastly, the retrofitting of other energy saving devices, or ESDs, should still be considered to reduce the tank to wake elements of the emissions as far as possible. So there are considerations surrounding CapEx.
Okay, so what advice could we give to owners and operators at this point as to how they might be able to comply and get ahead in their preparations?
From our past experience of assisting clients with EEDI, EEXI, and CII compliance, we found that the owners and operators that get ahead of the game and start planning well in advance often fare the best. So this is something that we generally always endorse, and more specific to this, there are a number of things that we'd recommend doing now. I mean, firstly, the creation of vessel compliance plans. We'd recommend carrying out a regulatory baselining and gap assessments, identifying where you sit, what your options are, and what your remaining potential is. Incorporating relevant KPIs into organizational performance is also highly recommended. And within that, you should use tailored scenario modeling tools that are suitable for your current and expected future needs. As far as practical, these should include timelines and costs. And of course, there's a number of consultancy services on the market, including many classification societies who offer services such as this. And we also recommend that you carry out future fuel market studies and subsequently build out fuel procurement strategies. Of course, this needs to be relevant to the characteristics of your fleet, retrofit potential, remaining asset life, and the trading patterns, including assessment of any kind of green corridors that might be on your trading route. Secondly, that was still the first point. You should carry out technology feasibility studies. As I mentioned earlier, retrofitting ESDs will still play a major role going into the future, so it's important to know what options are available for your fleet. The next suggestion would be to build strong relationships and close collaborations between the owners and charters, which we believe will become business critical. And in addition to this, you should standardize and improve the quality of your data collection systems for your fleet to reduce reporting complexity and avoid any kind of inconsistencies between systems. And lastly, consider fleet pooling strategies and assess ways in which you can maximize the benefits of the surplus units and also the banking and transfer systems.
Okay, so some great points for people to take away there. So I think the natural next question is, how has the industry reacted to the development of these new regulations?
I mean, for the long time, the industry's called for a global approach to greenhouse gas neutrality, and it's a vital and necessary step forward. I think most of us here would agree. And in recent times, we've seen schemes like EU ETS and Fuel EU Maritime developed regionally. But this is the first of its kind, and it's a fully global measure. And it feels like the quotes, the industry is in transition, and this is a pivotal time in industry, being banded about for decades. However, those statements do now seem to be more applicable and truer than ever, with changes suggested by MEPC 83, with reduction trajectories essentially set from 2028 to 2035. The business case to invest in green fuels has been strengthened for at least another 10 years. However, that being said, shipping being shipping, there is always conflicting views. So some people believe the measures have gone too far, or unfair, unrealistic, or overly ambitious. There were well documented geopolitical tensions going into MEPC 83, and not least the elephant in the room being the withdrawal of the US delegate. It's been made clear that the US administration opposes the proposal, and more generally anything that they believe unduly burdens American people and American shipping. In this case, the potential fees imposed on US flag vessels based on their emissions and fuel choices. The US have threatened reciprocal measures against any fees charged to US flag ships or operated ships by countries that are part of the IMO emissions pricing system. And it is important to note that as a flag state, the US represents only 0.6% of the world's total fleet size in terms of deadweight. This is relevant because, of course, the share of deadweight tonnage plays a role in the IMO decision making and voting procedures. But a bit more recently, the US has formally rejected proposals, and I've seen today in a Splash News article that the US have threatened tariffs and port levies in an attempt to sabotage the IMO net zero framework. However, at the same time, as some disagree, others feel that measures maybe haven't gone far enough and fall short of the previous suggested targets. The new draft deal falls short of the original target set out in 2023 and those set in the Paris Agreement. And additionally, the new framework doesn't exclude or cap the use of any given fuel type. So the targets will likely incentivize a lot of ships to rely on the most affordable fuels in the market that can achieve baseline compliance, even if that means reliance on first generation crop-based biofuels, which potentially involve deforestation. And there's an argument that biofuels are not scalable at a global level, but the use of biofuels is almost encouraged by the new regulations, at least in the early years. And many LDCs and SIDs quite justifiably have argued that this food should be eaten and not burnt in the tanks of ships. But it's been said various members originally called for a universal carbon tax or levy, and they're not happy that only a smaller percentage of emissions will now be taxed or penalised. Some studies have estimated that only around 10% of shipping emissions will actually be liable to financial penalty up until 2035, such as in the form of remedial unit purchases, although this 10% does equate to about 100 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per annum, which is comparable to many countries' annual CO2 emissions. One particular version of the proposal suggested a universal levy of $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent should be brought in and applied across the board and charged to every vessel for every ton emitted, with no upper or lower thresholds, believing this would be the only way to raise sufficient funds. Some members have even called for emission trading scheme, and others have called for a combination or kind of bridge approach. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of reported lobbying from biofuel-rich countries and OPEC plus members, which has led to what many claim is a watered-down deal, both in the emissions reduction targets themselves and the non-compliance penalty costs that we'll likely end up with a clear compromise falling roughly in the middle of the range as proposed by different countries. And of course, some parties also consider the proposed remedial units to be too low and therefore only raise a fraction of the revenue that was estimated necessary to enable energy transition, whereby a number of studies anticipate that between 12 and 24 billion will be needed annually to fully support decarbonisation. If higher penalty costs for non-compliance had been put forward, then this would have provided a stronger incentive for a move towards truly greener fuels. But of course, the penalty price, like the price of the remedial unit, has to be relative to the difference between the fossil fuel and the sustainable fuel price. Otherwise, there will be no incentive to actually switch. And interestingly, and one of the final points is that the ACP Plus group, consisting of climate reps from African, Caribbean, and Pacific islands countries, which are nations highly dependent on shipping to survive, and are therefore the most sensitive to costs, consistently supported stricter proposals, as they claim that the costs and impacts of climate change will far outweigh those of any kind of financial penalty system. And this was despite the narrative of some other countries that the measures would harm economies and trade of them developing countries. And the last point, the decision not to include vessels of less than 5,000 gross ton has also drawn some criticism for contact vessels above 5,000 gross ton account for 85% of the global fleet. So the decision to set this threshold means that 15% of the global fleet are exempt from the MEPC proposals.
Amazing. Thanks, John. So finally, we are approaching the end here. As yourself and Scott have mentioned a few times, the new IMO regulations are similar to those set out in Fuel EU Maritime. So can you briefly touch on what those main differences are?
Yeah, I will do. Firstly, quite obviously, the geographical reach, with Fuel EU applying to ships calling at EU ports, regardless of flag, while the IMO NZF will apply to all international shipping. Secondly, the regulatory approach. Fuel EU has a single tightening target, whilst the IMO NZF will introduce a two-tier system, which Scott has already previously gone over, with both tiers becoming progressively more stringent. The rate of greenhouse gas reduction targets increases faster in the IMO framework. As we currently understand it, there may also be differences in the well-to-wake greenhouse gas fuel intensity values, as the life cycle assessments may differ in what they include. Next, the penalty system. Fuel EU has a fixed non-compliance penalty price of €2,400 per tonne of very low sulphur fuel oil equivalent, whilst the IMO NZF tiers financial penalties across two levels of compliance, as Scott described. These are currently set at $100 per tonne per CO2 equivalent for Tier 1 and $380 per tonne per CO2 equivalent for Tier 2 up until 2030. And that leads me on to the compliance mechanisms such as banking and borrowing. In Fuel EU, both banking and borrowing are permitted. Credits can be borrowed from future years' allowance to balance the current year's deficit, although are charged an extra 10% at repayment. In the IMO NZF, surplus units can be banked, but no borrowing from future years is permitted. Both Fuel EU and IMO NZF allow pooling between or within fleets, but in the IMO NZF, this is simply referred to as transferring between over and under compliant ships, noting that transference only permitted to balance a Tier 2 deficit. And in terms of banking, banked units in Fuel EU do not have an expiry date, while those banked under the NZF will expire within 2 years. And that really is a summary of the main differences, with a few other comparisons shown in this slide. It's rumoured that those behind Fuel EU are waiting to see how successful the IMO NZF turns out to be, with whispers about the possible abolishment of Fuel EU if the NZF turns out to be a success. The EU have already stated that Fuel EU will be re-evaluated in line with any IMO action. However, a major factor in that will be the gap analysis and environmental integrity between the two regulations. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, in the interim, it's unknown how the two regulations will align, and there's a lot of concerns about double taxation of vessels visiting EU ports. However, if there's one positive takeaway, it will be that the pain that many owners and operators have suffered as a result of Fuel EU will now make them better prepared and more knowledgeable prior to the implementation of IMO NZF due to the similarities in both systems.
Amazing. Thank you, John. So, Scott, I'll pass this one over to you. We've had a lot of information today. So with everything being said, how are we as a business assisting vessel owners and operators for preparing for and complying with the new regulations and those ever-changing industry requirements?
Yeah, so as I've said quite a few times during my section of the presentation, firstly, we need to wait and see what the outcome of the MEPC session is in October before we begin making any necessary changes or start offering any concrete advice. There's also now the issue of the US's position and how they might try to derail the proposal further down the line, especially based on today's Splash 247 article that John just referred to. As John also alluded to, the shipping industry itself is often very guilty at times of being very reactive. Here at Idwal, we will always endorse trying to get one step ahead and forward planning as much as possible. What I can say is we're already taking proactive steps here to ensure that our inspection framework can be quickly adapted to incorporate the new regulations if they're adopted. We did the exact same for EEDI, EEXI and CII, where we were the first third-party inspection service to include this within our core checklist. More specifically regarding the net zero framework, for a while now, I've been working on a full overhaul of the design and construction section of our inspection checklist, where things like alternative fuels, energy-saving devices, and improved efficiency features is going to play a prominent role. We've had this planned for a while now, well before these regulations were actually announced, and we're hoping to have this released in the coming months. Therefore, meaning that a big element of the regulations is already going to be assessed during every standard Idwal inspection. We also have a number of ideas as to how we're going to implement the net zero framework compliance into our Idwal grading algorithm, probably namely our forthcoming regulatory compliance subgrade, which forms part of the overall Idwal grade. We have a highly qualified in-house data team housed here at Idwal who are on hand to assist us within the technical team in implementing these changes to the criteria and the algorithm behind the Idwal grade. And lastly, related to the net zero framework, we now have a dual or alternative fuel inspection supplement, which is aimed to be used in conjunction with our standard condition inspection template. In its first iteration, at least, this has been designed to cover a wide range of alternative fuels, and was actually formulated in collaboration with one of our major partners. As I said during my introduction, despite being heavily involved in many client projects and offering other consultancy services, one of the actual main responsibilities of my role here is to track the industry, track industry trends and changes like this, including forthcoming regulations, and work out how we can implement the necessary aspects into our inspections and grading. In my spare time, I read a lot of reports, listen to a lot of podcasts, and attend a lot of webinars. As you've probably guessed by now, I don't get out much. But what we always try to do here is base our work and our research around actual case studies, also work closely with several of our major shipping company partners, and form all of our products around real data and the wants of our clients.
Thanks. Just before Paul ends, is to just like to add, I mean, Idril are quite justifiably most well known as a vessel inspection company. However, we do have a wealth of both seafaring and maritime assets management experience based in-house. We are internal technical team alone have over, I think, 250 to 300 years combined years working in the industry. We're a relatively young team, but we are enthusiastic, and we have a passion for raising safety standards on board vessels, increasing maritime efficiency, and improving vessel condition. We've got the ability to react quickly and to adapt our products to ever-changing industry needs, and we can also create bespoke products for specific client requirements. And regarding the IMO NZF, we have also carried out a lot of new building retrofits project supervision via both their boots on the ground approach and our internal consultancy services, which we feel are extremely well placed and applicable to these new regulations. And more generally, we offer a wide range of other maritime consultancy services where we can help manage projects from the outset to completion, and can create bespoke products and offer technical reviews of existing data sets. Idril pioneered the digitalization of the vessel inspection market, and this, in conjunction with the 15,000 plus unique IMO numbers that we've inspected, has allowed us to develop an unrivaled vessel data warehouse in an industry where data-driven decisions are becoming more and more crucial. We know that we're right at the forefront of our industry, and our industry-leading standardized checklist and grading system ensures that clients know exactly where they stand against the global fleet. And this benchmarking capability is offered through our online Idril ID platform. And of course, more information can be found on our website at idrilmarine.com/ID.
Amazing. Thank you both. So I think that's it. I know we have gone over slightly, but I hope you found this very useful. As always, if anyone is interested in learning more about the services that we, Idril, can offer, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. As mentioned at the start, this webinar has been recorded, and we will communicate this to all attendees early next week. Until then, please feel free to fire any questions. I have seen some great questions coming in through our Q&A, so we will get back to you. But if you have any others, please just get into contact with us at marketing@idrilmarine.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So before we do sign off, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Scott and John for being our panelists today. The presentation was full of some great and useful information, and we'll ensure that we could communicate that alongside the recording. So until we see you in the next webinar, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you in October. Thank you.